Hello again.
Hello.
Hello again.
Yeah, seems that we've done this many times over the years, but
Yes.
going back 30 years, I wonder if you can just remember, this is a really broad question, but what were you like in 1994, the first half?
What were you
like as people?
I think we were probably quite arrogant by then, weren't we?
Yeah.
Or quite confident. I think I think we'd always felt that we were kind of like this special band, and no one else felt it.
Yeah.
Which is it's a frustrating situation. And I think after the first album took off and everyone kind of caught up, I think we were just full of confidence and just had this sense that we had the secret to doing this music thing that people hadn't really caught on. So we were probably unbearable is probably the word that springs to mind.
Insufferable. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, insufferable and arrogant, like all good bands should be.
Exactly right. Yeah.
That's what the point of it is, really, to be insufferable and arrogant and try and do things that other people can't do. I suppose it was that we were very confident after the first album, after the success of the first album, and we wanted to sort of take it somewhere else. We were quite ambitious like that. We didn't want to just repeat the first album, which would have been the easy thing to do.
Yeah.
To repeat that blueprint, we wanted to sort of do something that really stretched it, and that was ambitious and probably ill-advised.
And you were in a position of strength because, as you
Yeah.
say, the first album had been very successful. So, justifiable arrogance in a way. And I suppose that allowed you a certain amount of devil-may-care daring to take risks on the second.
Yeah. Well, it gave us an audience as well. It gave us the sort of, the ability to know that there's people listening.
That's such an incredibly weird and powerful thing to know that whatever you do, people will listen to it. And lots of people will listen to it with kind of like wanting it to be good. And loads of people will listen to it hoping it's terrible. But, so much of kind of musical life and your early musical life is you just doing it in rehearsal rooms and empty gigs and stuff like that. And no one listening. And the sense suddenly when people are listening, when sold out gigs and stuff like that, it's really freeing, I think. You know what I mean? You're not second guessing yourself at all. You just have this feeling, right, people like what we do, so we can go further with it.
And I guess you'd been living in each other's pockets, of living out of carrier bags on tour for the first year and a half or whatever of being a sort of name band, because the money doesn't filter through immediately.
No.
If ever.
Yeah. But by this point, things had changed a little bit. And you famously were living in this kind of mad house that was owned by a religious sect up in Highgate.
The place in Shepherd's Hill in Highgate. Yeah.
And you, Matt, are probably in a position to answer this better than anyone. But if we knocked on the door of that house in early 1994 and were invited in, what scenes would we find?
You wouldn't be invited in.
Well, I mean, first of all, what I remember is just that the timetable was entirely on its head, wasn't it? It was this weird kind of thing that the day started about 4, with cups of tea, and finished probably, daybreak. That was the time for it to end. So if you turned up at midday, you'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. I just remember, it was more than anything, I just remember it being full of music.
Yeah, it was.
One of the things that happens is that when you make your first record, people start saying, oh, you sound like so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. And you don't contradict them. You go away and listen to these records that you're supposed to have. I can remember being compared to Scott Walker and thinking, right, I better find out who Scott Walker is.
Yeah, me too.
You know what I mean?
Who he was, really.
And it's this guy who was, I knew the Walker brothers, but suddenly finding these records. And I just remember it as being this time of kind of, I remember that house being full of music and full of books of photographs and stuff for covers, just full of art. You know what I mean? And I think there was a sense that what we'd liked had been quite narrow as kind of teenagers. It was quite kind of like indie. Brett had much more wide-ranging taste than me because he had an older sister. But there was just this sense of just pouring in all this stuff, you know, kind of literature and art and paintings and books, just everything. And it all being kind of grist for the mill, really.
I remember it being very sort of very creative, actually. I mean, it was sort of hedonistic but creative as well. It was kind of weird blend of those, you know, sort of dissolute and kind of, and I just remember it sort of devouring music, I used to go to the library and just get out photography books and just pour through them and look at these pictures and try and look for kind of images that I liked. And all of the inside sleeve images, I was sort of like working that out and sort of photocopying things. And I had this little studio and I used to like photocopy things and just put them up on the wall and kind of write lyrics on them. And some of them made their way through to the final cover. So the thing of Daddy's Speeding with James Dean, and I kind of wrote a bit of the lyric, little stuff like that. So it was all this sort of it was a very sort of fragmented kind of scattergun approach to the themes on the album that I was playing with. But it was kind of this exciting, mad sort of collage of things that somehow sort of made sense. And I wasn't quite aware of how they all made sense, of the themes that all tied them up. But I kind of like worked that out later, I think. But it was this sort of crazy, sort of exciting, very, very creative time, yeah.
You just know what you like, don't you? It's at the time you're not going, oh right, you know, kind of there's this Hollywood thing here. And then, you know, it's literally kind of like, okay, this interests me. This makes me want to make music. And then later on, you kind of like, oh, that links to that.
Yeah.
But at the time, it's quite natural, isn't it?
Yeah.
I know people always think of us as quite a kind of studied band, but I don't remember it kind of. We didn't really talk about it a lot.
No, and it's one of those things that's always slightly reverse engineered as well. Like whenever every album I've ever written, I'm not sort of sitting thinking, oh, this is going to be an album about this. It's not until much later in your career that you sort of like you feel kind of coherent enough to do that. Especially in the early days, you're just sort of throwing things together and working out what it means later, you know.
So I suppose the sort of chemical intake has been well documented as well, not least in your own book, Afternoons with the Blinds Drawn. But culturally, you're just filling your heads with that as well, and this big kind of cocktail of all of that stuff.
Yeah, it's sort of like, you know, scrambling your brain a bit in order to sort of achieve a sort of altered state, in order to sort of somehow process all this sort of deluge of art and stuff, and try and turn your brain into a machine that kind of like has an input and an output kind of thing, if you know what I mean. Like lots of the sort of like the sort of writers and artists that I was sort of listening to and kind of looking at, and people like kind of like Lewis Carroll and Crowley and all these sort of people having all those kind of influences, but getting it to sort of like come out as sort of Suede music, you know.
I saw you live in Cardiff just the other day, and one thing you said on stage with relation to a Dogman Star song was that this is from our second best album, the best in your mind being the latest one, Autofiction.
Yeah.
Now, given that all artists think that their latest album is the best one, that's the law, you have to think that, then that's high praise indeed for Dogman Star, that you rated that highly. However, there is also a bit in your book where you find it kind of frustrating that people always talk of Dogman Star as being the high watermark of Suede. So where do you sit with that, with the kind of status that it has?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, and when I say that on stage, it's slightly sort of tongue in cheek. I'm kind of aware that I'm being slightly provocative to the sort of hardcore fans, and I quite like playing with that a little bit. I don't know. Yeah, I'm much more comfortable with Dogman Star's legacy now. There was a few years where I felt it was a bit of an albatross. And I kind of wanted to escape it. So there's something, you know, there's a dankness to Dogman Star. There's a sort of a kind of like a gothic kind of doomed kind of quality that it has. and I sort of wanted to escape that, and I felt that was I was always felt slightly kind of weighed down by that, but I think that was more to do with the end of Suede Mark One, when we were sort of, I don't really know what we wanted to become. We just didn't. We wanted to become a band that wasn't in that mold, I think. And I think since reforming, we're much more comfortable with the reality of our legacy, and much more comfortable with what we do really well. And one of the things we do well, I think, is that kind of doomed sort of melodrama. And I'm quite willing to embrace that. So I'm quite comfortable with its legacy, I think.
Do you feel the same way about that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think for a little while, because of because of Bernard leaving in the middle of it, the kind of cartoon of the album, it was like kind of Fleetwood Mac or something, and it was all about kind of like personal relationships and blah 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 blah.
Yeah. And
the record, it was kind of shorthand for something. You know what I mean? Of a band falling apart, and kind of creative relationships and stuff. And I think it just, this vision of us as kind of like tortured gothic souls, especially after we started making Coming Up and Richard joined, we just weren't comfortable with it anymore.
Yeah.
And now I think we're old enough to know that you go through these stages in your life, and they don't define you forever. But at the time, it was kind of like, we're not these people.
But Dogman Star is one of those albums that people obsess about. It's one of those ones that's got a kind of cult status. It's got an aura around it. It's got a mystique to it that goes beyond being the most popular in terms of sales figures and so on. People who love it really love it. And do you get that? Do you understand why people feel so strongly about it?
No, I feel the same way. It's not, when I'm kind of disparaging about it, it's sort of slightly tongue in cheek. I think it's a wonderful record.
Yeah.
I think it's incredibly competent and incredibly strange at the same time. And I think some of the songwriting is absolutely great. And that, I mean, I shouldn't really be saying that. I should leave it up to third parties to say that. But I think that some of the songwriters, things like Wild Ones and Two of Us and those songs and Heroin, and even introducing the band, not really a song, but it's such a brave thing to do, open a record with that track. And I think that we were, in lots of ways, it was a kind of creative high, and it was sort of the ultimate the ultimate sort of end point of Suede Mark One. Really, it was in lots of ways a real high watermark, and I'm very proud of it. And I do get that people sort of feel sort of differently about it. They don't feel that it's just another record, that it has some other quality. And I do get that, because I feel the same way about that record, and I feel the same way about other records that I think we emulated, things like Hounds of Love and all that sort of thing. I'm not kind of trying to say that Dogman Star is, how it sits against Hounds of Love or anything like that, because that's a fool's game. But there was lots of great records that had that sense of breadth about them, and that sense of ambition that I think we managed to get in Dogman Star.
I think it's also it's a much more introspective record than the debut or the ones that came after it. And I think for a certain kind of person who sits alone in a dark room with headphones clamped tight, it represents a kind of a way of living that they just get. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think for people who are going to be obsessed about music, it's a record that's easy to get obsessed about.
It seems like there was something in the air around that time, because you had other albums. You had In Utero by Nirvana, you had Holy Bible by Manic Street Preachers, Downward Spiral by Nine Inch Nails, and then Dogman Star. And I think with all those albums, there was a sense of what is troubling the person behind it. What's eating them? What's some kind of deep sadness or some kind of unspecified trauma. And when you listen back to it now, do you think what was eating away at me? What was eating Brett Anderson at that time?
Yeah, I do, but I know what it is. It's I think that if you wanted to sort of have one word that the album's about, if there's a theme, it's about disintegration. I think It's about disintegration, and it's about sort of distance. It's about people not being able to connect with each other. It's about kind of like, not being able to reach each other. And obviously that was I was sort of writing about kind of what was going on with Bernard, but I wasn't consciously writing about that. Very much not so, actually. I was writing about other things, but obviously that whole spirit was finding its way into the writing. And even though I didn't write Two of Us about me and him, and I didn't write Still Life about it, had that kind of sense of angst, that sense of not being able to kind of communicate with someone, that sense of someone drifting away from you. And I suppose I expressed those feelings as sort of like vignettes about relationships, and something like Heroin is about kind of a porn obsessed kind of teenager unable to connect with the real world. So there's all these sort of like, everything is about sort of lack of connection, and that was what was happening. But I think it was about Bernard drifting away from the band, but it was also about me becoming dislocated from reality as well. And that's part of the journey of fame. Dogman Style could never be anyone's first record, because it's very much about where fame takes you, and where it takes you isn't always good, as we know very well. Sometimes it is, and there's a sort of sunnier side to Dogman Style, which is sort of like, it deals with sort of like ambition and sort of where you can go. Dogman Style, the sort of evolution of the being from lowly to sort of up on high. But that's almost a red herring. It's not really about that, but that's part of the process of the journey. It's about the kind of the dark side of that evolution as well, I think.
Yeah, it's like that Zalinger graphic of the March of Progress, isn't it? Of human evolution. And also it's sort of, I guess it's redolent of Bowie with, Diamond Dogs, Starman and all of that. Yeah.
I wasn't kind of consciously referencing those Bowie things,
no.
but I might have been subconsciously, sort of thing.
You talk about where fame takes you, and I guess to some extent you were having a great time with that, but is it fair to say that Bernard wasn't? He was kind of struggling with the trappings of it.
I think it's really fair to say that. Yeah, I think he'd probably agree with you. He was, he'd sort of, for various reasons, he just wasn't comfortable with what was going on. I think the rest of us were sort of more just sort of going along with the ride, and kind of enjoying kind of, I don't know, the perks of fame sounds a bit kind of like whatever, but just, we worked hard for it, and I was kind of enjoying kind of being this person. I was kind of 25, 26. It was fucking great in a way. And of course, every pride, before pride comes a fall, sort of thing. You're always going to get tripped up by it. But I was kind of sort of aware of that, but enjoying it nevertheless, sort of thing. But no, I don't think Bernard was ever really comfortable with sort of that world. No.
Obviously, he had other things going on as well. He was processing the sort of grief of his father's illness and death, and all of that, and it led to a situation, I suppose, where he was in a much different kind of headspace to the rest of you, and you end up with this very unusual songwriting process where he's sending cassettes via sort of jiffy bags, and you're recording at different ends of the day in the studio. At the time, did that seem tenable to you, or were you thinking this can't work?
I don't really know if I had any kind of. I suppose I just sort of hoped it would sort of kind of get better, but I didn't really. When you're that age, you don't have that sort of kind of catastrophizing thing. Do you know what I mean? You just sort of think, oh, just get on with it. I didn't really kind of think, oh, where are we going to be in 5 years with this? It was just like, let's finish this record. This is an amazing record, and let's finish it by whatever means we can finish it. And I didn't really think beyond that sort of thing.
I think also there's just a sense of trajectory. You know what I mean? I think there was just we were on the up, you know what I mean? From the moment that people first started coming to see us, there was just this ramp that we went up, and then the record came out, and the single came out, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And I don't think, if you'd said to me, look, bands split up, people die, all these things are going to happen in the future, I would have said, oh yeah, I understand that. But you don't, at 24, 25. You think, this is how it is, you know what I mean? And it's getting bigger and better. And I think there was just a sense that's happened a lot in Suede of Suede doing stuff and this machine moving forward, and you just hanging on for the ride. You know, I don't think, even when Bernard left, I don't know why we weren't absolutely bricking ourselves. You know what I mean? But there was just this sense that, right, we're doing this stuff and we're writing songs and we're making music, and every time we do it, we get a bit better at it and people like it more. So let's just keep doing it.
Also, because you were the biggest guitar band in Britain at the time, you didn't have the luxury of just having this stuff go on behind closed doors. It was becoming very public, Bernard saying something about, Brett drives me insane, and suddenly that's on the front cover of Vox magazine. And then when the news breaks that he's no longer in the band, people literally chasing you across the road and stuff like that. That can't have made it easy either.
No, it didn't make it easy, but no, it didn't make it easy. But it's sort of one of those things you have to learn to deal with, isn't it? And we kind of I think we've sort of become quite not comfortable with that whole world, but sort of, we accepted that there's a flip side to these things, and it's not all good. You know what I mean?
And I think it was a time when you never showed any vulnerability whatsoever. You know what I mean? It was absolutely the worst thing you could do. Yeah. You know what I mean?
That's really true, isn't it? I think that it's the culture is an interesting to look back at things culturally.
Yeah.
Then and if somehow you could project Dogman Star into the modern world, we would have embraced a vulnerability.
Oh yeah.
Whereas
totally.
I think when it came to promoting the record, we were quite sort of bloody minded about it, saying everything's going to be fine. And in a way that sort of got us through it, that sort of bullshit mentality, didn't it? But
totally, fake it until you make it.
Yeah.
But it was very much, I always think of that time and kind of the music scene there as being weirdly kind of like Thatcherite. It's like everyone against everyone else, and if you made this slightest error or you showed any kind of weakness, everyone would just leap on it. And you think of the people and how we talked about other bands and how other bands talked about us. You know what I mean? It's kind of like jaw dropping.
It's brutal.
Yeah, there was a kind of Darwinian nature to it, wasn't there? There was if you can't hack it, then you're not good enough. Do you know what I mean? There's that sort of element.
That kind of that primal scream thing when River Phoenix died. They said lightweight. You know what I mean? And you think about it now, and you're kind of like, But at the time, it was kind of like that was it. You kind of toughed it out.
Yeah.
You said a lovely thing once that you sensed the pain and the sadness in the music that Bernard was making, and you tried to respond to that and try to sort of, echo that, as it were, in your own writing.
Yeah, no, I did. I think especially with the two of us, the music to that. I remember I've said it before. I just remember watching him play that he was in the live room playing the piano. I was in the control room, and it was spellbinding actually, just watching him play it, and just the melody. And I don't think it's the first time I'd heard it, but it was quite early on, and it was just a beautiful piece. And there was a sadness and a power to it that I suppose I was interpreting as his sadness, his response to what was going on with his father, and it was very moving actually. And I tried to do the music justice in my own way, and kind of like inject a sort of my own sort of version of that sadness into what I was doing. But I did sense that,
you talked in your book about trying to push things beyond the limits of your abilities, and that's such a sort of an audacious thing to do for a band only on their second album. But I suppose you were doing things that a band on their debut album couldn't possibly do. So, for example, recording tap dancers to use as percussion that ended up not even being used, and bringing in a whole orchestra, or just having a random kind of sax interlude, and all. I think Bernard recording the intro to the Wild Ones on the roof of a car, and all this kind of mad stuff that bands just don't do. But was this all part of the mood at the time of let's just try anything, try everything?
Yeah, I think we've always been pretty ambitious. I can look back I can pinpoint things about the first two records specifically where I think the ambition gets in the way, and I wish we'd have been advised by someone a little bit more sober and just said, do you know what, maybe this is something like the phasing in the chorus of Moving or something like that. And I also think that the orchestra in Still Life is over the top as well. I think it would be much more powerful and poetic if it had been understated, if it had been a sort of octet or something like that. There's something a little bit kind of Andrew Lloyd Webber about it, which I don't really like, which I still feel a bit, but I can hear there's a sort of bratty ambition that I just have to accept is just the kind of people we were. And we were the kind of people that were just sort of like, right, we're going to have a 40-piece orchestra on this, fuck it, do you know what I mean? Yeah. Let's see how the other bands respond to that. There was a kind of that sort of competition that we're going to go. They can only do this, but we can do that. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. We're kind of like we're capable of doing things that other bands can't do.
It's a love of extremity, isn't it? And on that record, it's always like, okay, how can we take this? How can we make this more what it is? You know what I mean? So the intro, the first track, is basically one chord. You know what I mean? Let's just stretch it out and not have any chord changes. This one could do with strings. Let's get an orchestra. You know what I mean? It's kind of, even like the ballad, even something like Black or Blue. Like take the drums off it. Make it as kind of liquid and as I mean, Britpop didn't exist then, but as kind of like as un-indie as possible. I think there was a real sense of this was the world that we'd come from was not a world that we wanted to live in. And the people that we were listening to and the people we were kind of trying to emulate were up there, and that's where we wanted to go.
But even though Britpop didn't exist yet, you'd already to some extent been caricatured as this thing, this kind of London band singing about London things. And it seems that, well, hearing you talk about Dogman Star, it seems as if a lot of the themes and the meaning of it have only become apparent to you kind of in hindsight rather than at the time. But it does seem that there was this intention to move away from that, move away from this kind of London-based, almost sort of, kitchen sink drama aspect, and write in a more universal way.
Definitely, yeah. And I think that, the kind of blueprint of the first album, that set the tone for Britpop. I think Suede was the first Britpop album, really. And the tone was set by this kind of caricature of who we were as a band, and the caricature was this sort of like slightly, this kind of London
blouses,
sort of
Cockney accent,
street, but kind of slightly effeminate sort of thing, and that became a different thing, and that was the sort of starting point for Britpop. That's where it came from, and it kind of like mutated into the beast we all know and love.
I think there was that other thing that people forget, that we hadn't been anywhere. You know what I mean? The reason we wrote about London is, we haven't really been 40 miles outside London.
That's a really key point. I've said it before, but it was like, we weren't celebrating London, we were documenting it. And we weren't celebrating England, we were documenting it. We weren't celebrating Englishness. We just happened to be English. And if we'd have been born in Japan or something like that, we would have written about Tokyo. And it's just it was an attempt to write about real life and the kind of like the sort of London bled through into that because London was our real life. My real life was trudging up to Edgware Road and signing on, and kind of, you know, going back on the tube and living on fucking peanuts and eating shit food. You know, I mean, that was my life. You know, holes in my shoes and stuff. That was how I lived, and so that kind of came out in the songs. It wasn't a kind of like a sort of a kind of social tourism where we were kind of like writing about these things from a position of privilege. We were living this world. I was living in a flat where I put my hand down on the floor and it would gradually turn black because the fleas would jump on it. You know, that was that kind of world. So yeah, it was just trying to document that world. And I always saw that there was an nobility in poverty, and I wanted to somehow talk about that. That was always a really key thing to see, to look at the world that I'd come from, my life as a child and my parents' lives, which was sort of pretty destitute, and to sort of try and find an honor and a nobility in that, and not to just sort of like portray it as some sort of silly kind of
an affliction.
Yeah, to try and see that there was something worthwhile in that. Because sometimes I think if you're poor, you have to.
Yeah.
You know.
I think also one of the things about Dogman Star is it's the first record we made after having been anywhere. You know what I mean? That we'd been to the States and we'd been to Japan and suddenly had this sense, I think, of a lot of things, of kind of like horizons opening up. But I think you get this incredible, I know for me, it was a big deal when we first played Japan, and you were playing these songs that people had told you, oh, they're all about London, you know, blah, 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 blah. And you're suddenly playing to people who don't know the references or anything, but they totally get it, you know what I mean? They get the feeling and they get the emotion of it. And I think there was a real sense, again, with Dogman Star, just understanding that what you did could really reach people, not just in a kind of like, we're going to be famous in London, but could touch people and could change people's lives and all these kind of things.
You've spoken about disintegration being one of the themes of the album, but another, I'm going to group three songs together here. So Heroin, Daddy Speeding, and This Hollywood Life seem to be about this gap, this chasm, this abyss between really grim realities of people's lives. You know, the guy in Heroin's living in a slum, as you call it, and the glamour of Hollywood, and the glamour of showbiz that is sold to us as consumers. That kind of disconnect. Was that something at the time that you consciously decided to write about, or is that something that you only see that in hindsight?
No, I definitely consciously was slightly obsessed with all those kind of like the sort of screen legends, and I'd sort of sit and look at books and kind of like I don't know, I liked sort of, I suppose I was using their fame as a kind of as a way of talking about our journey, sort of thing, and talking about, you know, that like you say, the chasm between those two things, between the adorer and the adored, you know, those two, the extremes of those two existences, kind of thing. And looking at their lives and I suppose the sort of fantasy of those lives, and I suppose, you know, reflecting on the kind of the opposite side of that, really. So yeah, I was kind of quite obsessed with fame, but again, it's part of the sort of, I suppose it's part of the Dogman Star kind of evolution kind of thing. So yeah, it sort of seemed to. And I suppose there's another element as well. I was kind of aware that I was kind of drifting away from reality and forming relationships with people that weren't real. And some of those people were people that were dead, that were in films. And the same parallel between sort of like, you know, forming friendships with people in soap operas and forming sexual relationships with people in pornographic magazines. So almost like, I suppose it was me disappearing into a virtual world before virtual worlds existed.
It's what people call parasocial relationships now, isn't it? It's the whole thing.
Yeah. So it was that. So it was a dislocation from real people into sort of like various sort of fantasy worlds, I suppose.
Matt, you spoke about the idea of just having an intro with one chord and just sort of stretching it and see how far you can go with that. And of course, there is on the CD reissue the Eno version of Introducing the Band, 16 minutes long. Tell us about that.
I mean, I have no idea if he's ever listened to that. It's kind of like it's such a missed opportunity. It's one of my favourite Suede tunes, remixed by one of my favourite musicians of all time, and it's utterly unlistenable. It's just the reverbs or something? I've never got more than kind of 3 minutes. I don't know if anyone has. There's probably someone out there who's listened to the whole thing, isn't there? Yeah. Just hoping that,
I know. I don't really know I didn't know what to say to him. I kind of like had to call him up and say, what I thought. And I was like, oh yeah, it's interesting, Brian. Yeah.
A friend of mine, when he got Dogman Star home, put it on, and there was a glitch on the CD just before the end of Introducing the Band. So it's just that bit, a sort of mantra just looping over.
Dying.
Yeah. And he just thought, and it went on for minutes and minutes and minutes. He thought, wow, they've really pushed the boat out.
They've really gone. That's great. I love that. We should have done that on the record.
Yeah. Like, what was the single that did that? The Knack, isn't it?
Yeah.
Does that
I'm in control.
Just,
I've got the beat.
And it just goes on forever.
Yeah.
Oh,
we should have done that. We should have just done Dying, I'm Dying for like 39 minutes. That would have been brave.
Yeah.
You reference Winterland in that song. Is that a Sex Pistols reference? Because which seems kind of prescient, because that's a band who are, the famous gig at Winterland where Johnny Rotten says, "Ever got the feeling you've been cheated?" It's a band about to disintegrate again.
Yeah.
Was that something that you were feeling at the time?
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely. That was a conscious reference to that moment when the Pistols fell apart, and I suppose parallels with what I was seeing going on with Suede. I don't exactly know when I wrote that line in terms of when Bernard was sort of leaving the band, or I think he was probably still in the band, but I could probably tell that he was not going to be in the band for long, and I suppose I was definitely referencing that. Yeah.
We were all slightly obsessed with that last gig, weren't we?
Yeah.
It's kind of like this is back in the day when you'd get footage on like VHS or something.
Very grainy.
And Simon had all this kind of like punk stuff. He had like Rude Boy and all those things, and he had the Winterland last gig, which is just, I mean, it's as a kind of musician, it's almost unwatchable, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah.
It's like watching a romantic breakup in real time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've always been obsessed with the Pistols. They've always been such a huge influence for me.
You use bodies as you walk on music.
Yeah, it's sort of something that people don't really necessarily sort of see in Suede, the kind of cliche of what Suede is sort of thing, but they've always been a really special band for me, and just that the drama of their short kind of career has always fascinated me.
And the album moves from that track into the lead single, We Are the Pigs. I mean, for that to be the lead single to begin with is bold, to say the least, isn't it? And I know that you were up against people in the record company who didn't want it to be the lead single.
I remember very well.
So what were the arguments that went on there?
Please don't release We Are the Pigs.
Yeah.
It's
like
a terrible thing to
be
the
it's a
first
bad
single.
idea. We
can't
release that.
Radio won't like it. They were right about that.
They were absolutely right. No, I remember people high up in Sony were kind of like begging us not to do it, and I think that just made us more determined.
I mean, the thing is, it's a brilliant taster for the album in terms of kind of like summing up what you're going to get. I don't think there's anything better. It works. It works in that way. As a way to get a load of radio play, probably not so much.
I think it was either that or New Generation, and New Generation is a much kind of safer pop song, but it didn't. For me, New Generation didn't really mean much lyrically, and I don't know. It's a great song in a way, and as a throwaway pop song, but it doesn't have the kind of the gravity of We Are the Pigs.
I guess New Generation is the first time you're writing about the people around you, the sort of scene around you and your fans and that kind of thing. And that's something that you would pick up again in Trash and Beautiful Words and stuff like that. So it's kind of significant.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. but it didn't have the kind of the weight of We Are the Pigs, and I sort of like the sort of violence of We Are the Pigs and the end of it and stuff like that. But it was definitely ill-advised releasing that as the first single. I think we thought that we sort of thought that we couldn't really do any wrong at that point, and we didn't realise that that all of the sort of media channels that are open to us we didn't think they could close down.
That's exactly it.
We thought that we were always going to be A-list on Radio 1, no matter what we did, and then suddenly we're like, hang on, why isn't that on the A-list on Radio 1?
This is what I'm saying, that in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, you know what I mean? Every band we'd ever loved and watched, the Sex Pistols, we just thought it's just going to get better and better, and more people are going to love us. You know, it's kind of
we didn't
catastrophize,
did we? At all?
So you're coming back with a single.
The exact opposite.
Yeah, we kind of just sort of
idyllicized.
Yeah,
you know what I mean.
You got this single that says, you wake up with a gun in your mouth, and you're thinking, Simon Bates will play that at 10 o'clock in the morning. Yeah. But it's a great track.
But they played Animal Nitrate. I mean, that's pretty dark, So I don't know.
It's got a real swagger to it. It's almost sort of Shirley Bassey-esque in some ways.
It's those saxophones and stuff in it.
So it's daringly uncool, I think, of you to write a song like The Wild Ones at the time that you did, because bands, certainly indie bands or bands from the alternative kind of sector, didn't write really kind of open-hearted, romantic love songs.
No, it's quite straight, isn't it? It's the sort of straightest, probably the straightest thing we've ever written, actually. It's not. There's no particular twist to it. I suppose it's got a kind of like a bittersweet melancholy to it, but apart from that, there's no. It's almost like a song that someone else could cover.
Yeah, Roy Orbison or something like that. Definitely.
In fact, who was it who covered it? Was it Tony Christie or something? It was someone like that, wasn't it?
Oh God!
It was one of those old crooners, wasn't it? They did a cover version. Anyway, again, it was just trying to do something that kind of, the indie world wouldn't do, I suppose. Trying to break out of that and do something with that. I suppose it's almost like trying to be a bit like someone like, trying to be like Wichita Lineman or something like that. Yeah. That kind of big sort of scope of a pop song, a kind of big romantic sort of thing. Beautiful song. It's still
it's
still my
about
favourite
being
Suede song.
kind of part of the pantheon, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's literally, we didn't want to be in the world of the Camden Folk and or even kind of like the Melody Maker or anything like that. It was a sense of kind of, we want to be up there, one of those bands. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I think it's just it is that sense that runs all throughout the album. You can almost look at tracks on the debut and say, we just took them all further. You know what I mean? They all just went like a step darker. The dark ones are darker, and the romantic ones are more romantic. The drawn out ones are more drawn out.
When I spoke to you recently, Matt, I think you had a theory about something which may have influenced The Wild Ones that you said you've never put to Brett before. So I wondered can you remember this?
I can't. What did I
was
say?
A Belgian possible influence.
Oh, If You Go Away.
Yeah.
I mean.
Oh yeah, that's not.
That's in there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Jacques Brel. Yeah. Absolutely, I love Jacques Brel.
And just a question about the lyric to that song, the song that's playing on the radio. In your head, was there a particular song that you're talking about?
No, it was The Wild Ones that was playing on the radio.
Perfect.
It was supposed to be this sort of circular thing.
What's the song that does that famously? Oh Yeah, by Roxy Music. They're playing Oh Yeah on the radio.
Yeah.
And there are no songs called Oh Yeah. I have checked. You know what I mean? So it's just,
Oh, I didn't realise it was as direct as that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're playing Oh Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know you're very proud of The Wild Ones, that you consider it possibly, your best song.
Yeah.
The Two of Us has got to be right up there alongside it.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's a very open-hearted, very romantic song, and nobody else was really doing that kind of thing at the time.
No. Yeah, it's a. I think The Two of Us is a great song as well. I think that it's a shame that we didn't really. I think it's too minimal on the record. It's funny because I would have gone the other way with Still Life, and I would have actually made Two of Us a full band. We play it live now. I think it's kind of more powerful in a way. It's a little bit too long to be this sort of just piano vocal ballad, I think. But I think it's a great song. I think it's an amazing melody.
To sing lines like "Can you hear me through the rain," it's, Barry Manilow could sing that almost.
Yeah.
But it's also got an element of "Well I Wonder" by the Smiths, and to kind of balance those two things in a song.
Yeah, I've always kind of found sort of pop lyrics really moving. And people are always really sort of disparaging of kind of like, lyrics from pop songs and they're meaningless and stuff, and they're just trite and stuff. And when they're sung in the right way, they can be incredibly moving. Those sort of like pop songs that you hear in the back of a taxi late at night or something, and they're popular for a reason. They really hit you in the heart. And I wanted to sort of write one of those songs that was sort of, I've always sort of kind of opposed the thing about writing universally. I've always wanted to write ununiversally, whatever the opposite of universally is. I always wanted to write specifically. But I suppose with Wild Ones, I was trying to write universally and trying to write one of those sort of things that can literally apply to anyone's love life kind of thing, Yeah.
Another relatively simple or deceptively simple song, I would say, is The Power.
Yeah.
Because, it's a fairly easy kind of strummed sort of song, but it's got lines like, enslaved in a pebble dashed grave with a kid on the way, which is great writing and quite dark. And again, it's about people living these fairly grim lives, but dreaming of something else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's the sort of most obvious sort of, in a way, The Power is the sort of the song that kind of like sums up the Dogman Star kind of evolution thing, I suppose. It's sort of like, give me the power, give me something more than this sort of thing. I want to become something more than this. It's interesting about when we first wrote it, I thought it was quite special, but I think it's actually quite weak. I don't think it's the best song on the album. I think I think it would have been, if we'd have replaced The Power and Black or Blue with something like Killing of a Flash Boy and I don't know what else, My Dark Star or something like that, I think it would have been a stronger record.
You've included the French version of The Power, La Puissance, on the 4CD, on the CD version. I remember being in Manic Street Preacher's dressing room in Le Bataclan in Paris in '94, and hearing you through the wall rehearsing The Power in French. I'm not sure if that was the first time you played it.
Yeah, it probably was. It was the first and only time.
But I wonder why you chose that song particularly to be the one that you translated for the audience.
Yeah, I don't really know. I just it sort of had that kind of Jacques Brel sort of feel to it, didn't it, I suppose? Yeah. Actually, when I say it's the first and only time, I did try it again. Do you remember? We played in Paris a couple of years ago, and everyone just laughed at me.
Yeah,
it was quite embarrassing.
Apparently, the translation was hilariously bad.
But it was like, you think that someone I was trying, so you just give me, that's sweet. Well done.
Have you not been to France before?
Yeah.
When you try and speak French,
and there was like everyone's going. So I'm not doing that again.
He has embarrassed himself.
So, Black or Blue and The Asphalt World, two songs which were inspired by a relationship that you were in at the time. Do you find it hard, with that relationship being long into the past, to sing those songs?
Not really, no. I don't. I can sort of go back and revisit my sort of mind in those days. And I think it's sort of like, good writing's good writing sort of thing. A good writing kind of contains its own motivation, in the same way that you can sing someone else's song and it can still be powerful to you, and you can try to map it onto your world. And no, I don't have a problem with that. I think it's an I mean, Black or Blue it's not my favourite song on the album by a long way, but Asphalt World is pretty strong. and I think the kind of the sort of the dynamics in the relationship are kind of like, I really like the way that they're sort of introduced in the song. I think that's really, it's quite a strong piece of narrative writing, the way that the song it sort of introduces the kind of world in the first verse, but then the sort of second verse gets more specific, and she's got a friend, they share mascara, I pretend, and suddenly you kind of know what the song's about, or you kind of start to know what the song's about, and then then it gets more intense, and that's how it feels when the sex turns cruel. And I think at every stage of the song, the writing is kind of revealing something more about the relationship, and I think it really works. So again, it's like it contains its own motivation as a piece. It's almost like sort of acting out a play or something like that, acting out a well-written play as an actor or something, I suppose.
And the music does the same thing as well. I mean, it builds all the way through and then changes. It has this ups and downs. But there's exactly that sense of building and then fracturing as there in the music. Yeah.
There's almost as much mythology around the Asphalt World as there is around Dogman Star as a whole, particularly about the intended length of it and all of that. There's a story that Bernard wanted it to be 18 minutes long, and you all fell out about that. And there's an 11-minute edit on this CD. So, tell us about that.
Yeah, I definitely remember there being kind of sort of tussles about that song, and I can't remember exactly how long he wanted it to be. I think he would probably say that he didn't want it to be overly long now, but I definitely remember there was disagreement about it, and we were saying no, it's got to be short. But I don't know how long that. I always thought there was a much longer version actually, but when we went through all the tapes looking for it, we couldn't find it. Well, so maybe there wasn't. Maybe I might be rewriting in my head. It's a long time ago.
As far as I can remember, there was a longer version, but it wasn't a song. It wasn't a finished track. It was Bernard playing guitar. And it wasn't
whatever version we recorded or a rehearsal.
Of him in the studio playing.
Oh, okay.
That was longer than what we had, but not a song put together that the rest of us were playing on. Blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Because I don't think Simon played drums for 18 minutes. You know what I mean? I can't remember that, and I don't think Simon remembers that.
So there's a big breakdown in the middle. Yeah.
So if there is something there, it's not this glorious finished thing.
I do remember
perhaps we should just say there is. I'm really bored of kind of, there's an incredible,
much better version than
18. I mean, Brett goes off raps for about 5 or 6 minutes. There's an orchestra and everything, and the reason that we haven't released it is we're just mean that way.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those things, isn't it? It's the sort of there's such a sort of mystique to unreleased things. That kind of like what it could be like sort of thing, and it's become a bit of a legend in a way.
Speaking of orchestras, Still Life, I have to admit, the first time I heard it, I think I burst out laughing, and kind of laughing with joy at the sheer audacity and balls that it took for you to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I look back on it now, and I think that it's slightly cheesy, which is probably why it gives that impression. It's very, very mainstream. Brett, you were saying kind of Andrew Lloyd Webber.
I love that.
I said kind of Black Beauty. It's got that. It's very. In a weird way, it doesn't fit with the rest of the album. That there's something very light entertainment about it, and I think if we'd known now how to kind of arrange things, or if we'd had someone like Neil who kind of like knows these things, then we could have done something really interesting with it. It's a bit, we'll just hand over to the BBC Light Orchestra now, and they'll play us out.
It was a bit like that. Yeah, I don't think the guy that arranged it really sort of particularly knew about the band. It was almost like that I think. It was that guy. What's his name?
Brian Gascoigne.
Yeah.
So he worked
and
with David Sylvian and
Yeah, he'd done sort
Scott
of.
Walker. And,
Yeah, maybe I don't know. Maybe sort of slightly misunderstood, but yeah, you're right. I think it was almost like slightly handing it over to someone
Yeah.
else, wasn't it?
Yeah, we didn't
And
have the
we
kind
were
of-
okay. We don't really know about this world, and I think we're also a bit seduced by the sound of it as well. I remember sitting in the studio listening to them. Was it CTS, that place?
I can
Was it
remember
CTS?
sitting looking down on
Yeah,
it. And
it was like this studio where they did
Yeah.
orchestras, and I remember looking at the 40-piece orchestra, and you know, when you're kind of used to sort of like scratchy guitars and stuff like that, suddenly hearing the sumptuous nature of it is very seductive,
Yeah.
and hearing
something you've written.
your
yeah.
little song as being, it feels like, oh my god, this is proper music. Do you know what I mean? Rather than kind of amateur music. Do you know what I mean? And that you kind of get a bit sort of like starry-eyed about that. But like I said, I think it would have been better if we'd have made it understated.
So I wanted to talk about the artwork of the album, which really seems to carry the spirit of the record.
Yeah.
So it's this photo by Joanne Leonard. How did you come across that in the first place?
Well, I just used to have all these photography books, and just, you know, I bought from Portobello Market, like 60s and 70s photography, I suppose, specifically. And I used to sort of like pour through it. Most of the early artwork, all the early sleeves, the Drowners and all those sorts of sleeves, and Animal Nitrate, they're all kind of like pieced together bits and pieces from these books I used to have. And yeah, it's just a picture I absolutely loved. But before we came up with that, it was going to be something very different. I don't know if you've seen the original idea,
Yeah.
which is like 120 Days of Sodom, the Pasolini thing. It's like it was a still from Pasolini. I used to do this sort of like cut and paste thing quite a lot. I used to Xerox stuff and then take sort of like faces from other things and put them on. And that was one of those. I don't know where the face came from, but the body was from 120 Days of Sodom. And I can't remember what the situation, but the record company were like,
Yeah.
it was a bit
I think
Spinal Tap, wasn't it?
originally they were like, you definitely can't do this.
Yeah.
And we were kind of like, we really want to do it. And then it was like, oh yeah, we're going to get sued. We can't get the rights.
I remember it was the American record company,
Yeah.
wasn't it? It was.
But I think that whole
Sony
thing
in New York
was just a lie. They were just like, no.
Yeah,
way,
it was
know.
too. And looking, I'm really glad we changed it actually, because it could make it a completely different record.
Yeah.
But it was just this sort of stark black and white. For anyone who hasn't seen it, it's sort of stark black and white image of a naked person with a dog chain, kind of like that. It was a bit. Someone did say it was a bit like Smell the Glove. Wasn't
Yeah,
it?
there is that about it. and it's. I mean, the thing is, I think we were all kind of obsessive about record sleeves. But one of the things I always think of a sleeve as it's kind of a filter for the record. It makes you see a record in a certain way,
Imagine how
doesn't
you'd
it?
see Dogman Star through if that was the sleeve of it. Though now it's so weird. Isn't
Something it'd be more brutal,
Yeah.
I think, less nuanced.
Because there's something so perfect about the image of Dogman Star, the man on the bed, the picture we used.
Yeah.
It's so that music. There's a dank. It's even the right color, isn't it?
I think that's that's such an important
It's
thing.
dark
The
green.
color of record
That's
sleeves.
the color of the record. It's so
Yeah.
weird.
I think of that all the time. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? It's a way of kind of like of coloring the record.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Of just of bringing out highlights and stuff. I think it's a really good sleeve because it's also much more passive than the
Yes.
Pasolini
Oh, gotcha.
one.
Yeah,
It's
it really
much more kind of like laid back, and in a weird way, we've kind of gone back to that image many times.
Yeah, we've gone back to
haven't we?
those themes, haven't we? The mattress, and the mattress
course,
is the theme that we keep going back to. We don't seem to be able to escape from it.
And
Yeah.
it is very reminiscent of the Death of Chatterton, the pre-Raphaelite
Yeah,
painting.
yeah.
Was that something that you were aware of at
Not
the time?
consciously.
Yeah.
No, not consciously.
But it's, just that kind of... You can't tell if the person is prone on the mattress because they've had a really good time or a really bad time.
Exactly. But that's the sort of... I think that's why we keep returning to mattresses, because the mattress is such a sort of symbolic place, isn't it? It's a kind of like... you can kind of go beds can be places of sort of depression and vulnerability and sex and sleep. There's so many sort of like human kind of conditions that get played out in beds, and they can be depression. They can be so contrasting. It's not just one tone, and I like that ambiguity. And yeah, you're right. There's a sort of dark sexuality to it, isn't there? That you're not quite sure whether it's sort of post-coital or sort of whether it's just about I feel like shit. Do you know what I mean? Or whether I'm just tired.
There's also something about the private made public, isn't it? In that and in lots of those images.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That it's a snapshot of someone's life that you wouldn't normally see. You know, that the low or the high points.
Yeah.
This reissue of Dogman Star gathers together some of the contemporary B-sides, and you mentioned Killing of a Flash Boy as a song that maybe you both would have preferred to be on the album proper.
Yes. I think that was a massive mistake not putting that song. I don't think we realised quite how good it was when we were sort of recording it, and it's another stupid mistake.
It's a song that describes itself in being this heavy metal stutter.
It's just such a great, and we still play it live, and it's just such a great song to play live. And it's one of those songs that, obviously Suede songs know it and love it, but Suede fans know it and love it. Suede fans know it and love it. But, you know, when we play it to, you know, mainstream audiences like Cardiff, or I don't know if we played it one night, didn't we, in Cardiff? I can't remember. Anyway, but there's something about, there's a primal quality that it has that just connects
that kind of mechanic beat
that even if you don't know it, you kind of like, you know it's great. Massive mistake, but
but it's in the tradition of Suede writing amazing B-sides, which obviously the album Sci-Fi Lullabies, which gathers all your B-sides together, is probably as good as any of your studio albums.
Yeah, I love Sci-Fi Lullabies. You know, it's a great record. It's
But this is all exactly the same sense. It doesn't matter that we're putting a brilliant song as the third track on the CD, because all of our songs are going to be brilliant from now on, and there will never be any problem writing something as good as this again. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And that title, Sci-Fi Lullabies, comes from This World Needs a Father, which is another one that you've put on there. And that's a song that rhymes Star Machine with Shit-Stained Dream. So again, it's that idea of the kind of murky flip side to showbiz glamour.
Exactly, yeah. So that song's the only song that we've never played live, I think, isn't it? This World Needs a Father.
Yep.
We've never played that one live. And also, I think it features both Bernard and Richard, doesn't it? Didn't Richard play some...
Bit of organ on there.
Yeah, I think it's the only song that kind of has both Bernard and Richard, strangely enough. So,
and then there are curios like We Believe in Showbiz. What's the story?
Yeah, that was a weird one. That was something that me and Bernard wrote at Mike Joyce's house in like 1990 or something like that. Really? We went up to stay with Mike, and we sat in. I remember sitting in his cellar, him and Bernard writing that song together. So I don't know whether he didn't get a credit on it, but didn't. Sorry, Mike.
And then there are things like the full length Stay Together and an unedited Wild Ones, just to kind of make the point really that the Asphalt World doesn't stand alone. There are quite a lot of Suede songs which are allowed to breathe. And
that's an interesting point, because the full version of Wild Ones is definitely something that exists and everything. And that was the coda was that's how Bernard wanted the song to go, and me and Ed, I think after when Bernard had left, we were like, let's make it much better if we just loop the chorus, you know. It's sort of, and I think that was the right decision actually. I think the kind of like the longer version, it's interesting, but it's not as good as a pop song, I don't think. So.
I mean, that one of the things is that we liked and like pop music. You know what I mean? It's difficult because Dogman Star is seen as this kind of like brooding gothic monstrosity, but at the heart of it, we kind of wanted to make a record that was on the radio. We wanted to make a record that people heard. You know what I mean? I think it's important to us. Lots of the bands that we loved when we first started getting into, or that I loved, you know, kind of like the Jam, Blondie, and people like that. They made pop records. They made very cool pop records, but you know, and there was definitely with things like Wild Ones, it was like this is a pop song. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to show off. It doesn't have to say, you know, look at my guitar chops. You know what I mean? It's supposed to get in, move you, and go.
So you had this arrogance of youth and the arrogance that comes with success, which basically allowed you to make a record like Dogman Star in the first place. And somehow, despite all of the strife and the discord that went on during the making of it, you pulled it out of the bag. You've, you know, created this masterpiece. Having done that, how did you feel about the reaction to the album?
I thought it, you know, and I still think that it's such an incredible shame that the album, the sort of quality of the album was overshadowed by what happened with Bernard, really, and you know that the whole sort of psychodrama of him leaving, and that became the story of the album rather than how fucking good the album was. And yeah, I still really, you know, I mean, regret's the wrong word because it's just these things happen, but you only got to deal with it. But it's a shame, put it that way.
I think there was a weird thing that went on, that lots of the things that we tried to jettison were things that people wanted us to keep. I can remember, in fact, was it Stuart McConey's review when he said it should be more James Bolam and less James Dean.
But that was because the media was sort of kind of like following the Britpop.
Yeah, no, totally.
Britpop kind of like Pied Piper sort of thing, weren't they?
Yeah, totally. But that
and
for me was...
and we were consciously rejecting that.
Yeah.
I think we'd seen what started to happen with this Britpop thing, and we wanted nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
I think we were possibly still making Dogman Star when Britpop was sort of like bubbling along, wasn't it?
Well, but I think it was more of a personal thing, though, wasn't it? I think it was just there were lots of bands suddenly around London who had taken, you know, the clothes from Suede, you know, without the spirit of it. And I think we tried to make a record that wasn't parochial and wasn't kind of just coded for people who were just like us. And I know I found that kind of attitude, it should be more like this, really, really frustrating because...
Yeah, because I think we were sort of outstepped with the zeitgeist.
Oh, yeah, totally.
We were sort of ahead of the zeitgeist, if you want to be brutally honest about it. The first Suede album was the first Britpop album, but it was the first Britpop album sort of like a year too early. And then by the time, you know, if we'd have carried on banging that drum through 1994 with Dogman Star, it would have just been like, oh, really? Do you know what I mean? We had to go somewhere else with it. And I think it was great that we did. I love the fact that when Britpop appeared, Dogman Star is kind of... It's like
We Are the Pigs.
You can't get, you know, sort of more diametrically opposed than Dogman Star, really, I don't think. It's the anti-Britpop record.
But this is why Still Life is such a brilliant way to end the album, because, there may have been a load of bands around that were enabled or created, essentially, by the first Suede album. And fine, they can copy that. But to finish your album with a song like Still Life, it's like, right, go on then, copy that.
Yeah.
Boom.
No, totally. But I just think we could have done it better.
Yeah. When you play songs from Dogman Star now, which you do quite often, I know you went through a phase of not doing that. How do you feel when you're playing those songs?
I mean, I love playing them because they have inherent drama to them. I think that's one of the things that I think we discovered again when we came back was that kind of drama and that kind of tension and release is something that we do really well, but also something that can work really well live. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Those moments where you can draw it out and bring it back in and all those kind of things. And I mean, Two of Us is a really good example because we don't play it like it is on the record, but just that sense it has of opening up and the expansiveness of it.
Yeah.
I never really get bored of playing those songs.
And do you think the existence of a record like Dogman Star in your back catalogue kind of gave you the confidence when you got back together to make records like Night Thoughts, like The Blue Hour?
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Yeah, we were definitely referencing that sense of ambition with specifically those two records. Yeah, definitely. That's something that's kind of like now forever in our DNA and forever part of the sort of Suede thing. Is that we'll kind of like not with album 10, but possibly albums beyond that, we'll kind of go back to something like that at some point. I suppose that's definitely something that we can go back to.
Yeah, it's a muscle memory. You know what I mean? We know we can make records that have that. I think it's expansiveness. You know what I mean? That the borders to that record are fairly wide. But yeah, it's. I'm really glad to have it as something that we can kind of like draw from and
yeah.
I did feel that the leap between Blood Sports and Night Thoughts was analogous to that between Suede and Dogman Star, in the sense that Blood Sports felt like a solid return to Suede. It's a good Suede album, but you're suddenly going somewhere completely different with Night Thoughts. Yeah.
No, definitely, and I think you're absolutely right. But it's a kind of like that blueprint, that sort of like career leap kind of thing is we probably wouldn't have done it. We're much more conscious of it now, I suppose. That's the only thing. I think we're kind of conscious of that. And when it happened, Dogman Star was one of those records that you couldn't really recreate the circumstances of it. It was such extraordinary. We wouldn't want to. There were such extraordinary circumstances because it was born out of band tensions, but it was also born out of kind of like the extraordinary sort of life changes we'd been through as people and as a band, and the extraordinary sort of success of the first album. And all of these things are kind of like almost like once in a lifetime events. That you can never really recreate. So I'm always aware of that now when we're talking about doing something like that again. It's like you can't remake Dogman Star. I'm aware that that's always going to fail trying to do that.
When you look back on everything that went on, all of the circumstances around the making of Dogman Star, is there anything you wish you'd done differently?
The problem with that question is the answer is yes, everything, or no, nothing. You know what I mean? It's like, I totally regret kind of that we fell out, that we couldn't deal with each other better, that we couldn't have been, kinder to each other. I totally regret that. But the minute you start saying, okay, we just changed this one little thing about it, you'd just be different people. You know what I mean? It's a really, really good record of some young people getting famous and fucking up, and it wouldn't be that if we were more mature, gentler human beings. So I don't want to go through it again, but I'm glad it happened that way.
Yeah, I heartily endorse Matt's statement. I don't know what else to add to that, really. There's lots of things, specific things that I change about it. Lots of musical things. It depends if you mean musically or kind of like kind of personally. The whole what happened with Bernard and dealing with how we dealt with that, and how you can only really criticize yourself because you're the only person that oneself is the only person that you really have any responsibility over. And but we were young, and I didn't know how to deal with. I didn't have the kind of like the emotional tools to deal with these things, and this is why kind of bands are so exciting. Because it's young men put in this crucible, thrown into this this fiery, dramatic world where they simply don't have the skill set to be able to deal with all these with massive amounts of fame, massive amounts of drugs, and massive amounts of madness in their lives, so that they go fucking crazy. And sometimes out of the craziness you get there's some brilliant music made, but it's always destructive, and it always falls apart. And Dogman Star's sort of like, it's just a testament to that, really.
Seems like a good place to end. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon.
Cheers.